Well, critical media literacy is important, but first we need to be able to define it, which is the ability to critically analyze, evaluate, and interpret the information presented in news media. And it really involves people like understanding how news is produced and identifying bias and misinformation and being able to distinguish between fact and opinion. And this is a really important skill that people in any society need to have, because especially in a democracy, the United States is a democracy, and we uphold our First Amendment rights and we uphold free speech. Um, the power has to be in our hand to distinguish fact from fiction, especially when we live in a world where today less than 6 corporations control over 90% of what we see, hear, and read. And so we have to re-empower ourselves with these kinds of skills to be able to interpret what is information that works in the interest of the political establishment and elite, and what is information that is being used to manipulate and manufacture consent for certain policies or wars, and allowing us to be a very well-informed society so that we can vote in elected officials that truly represent us. I mean, that's what the purpose of having the critical media literacy skills and having that kind of education. Unfortunately, the very entities that the media and we the people are supposed to hold accountable, the very 1% political elite, the military class, the architects of wars, the very institutions that work to privatize certain institutions and industries, those are the ones who are now leading the charge to build the infrastructure to promote critical media literacy, but it's critical media literacy that works in their interests. And they do this under the guise of, of saying that we need to fight misinformation and fake news and Russian propaganda, when in reality, it's these very institutions and organizations and people that brought us, the Cold War with Russia. These are the same institutions that brought us the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. And so we look at the launch of NewsGuard, for example. NewsGuard is a news rating system that is founded by the very architects of the Iraq War and the war in Afghanistan. And 2 wars that were promoted by fake news and propaganda, the lies of weapons of mass destruction. And now they are leading the charge and the way to rate news organizations. And of course, they're giving every single corporate media outlet that led us into these wars that were based on lies, like the New York Times, MSNBC, and CNN and Washington Post. They're giving those news organizations big green check marks. And they are rating them on the system that shows that they are providing factual information, it's non-biased, et cetera, and that they're transparent in their funding, most of which this information is not even true. And then they target independent media outlets like Mint Press, like Consortium News, and they give us these big red X check marks and say that we are suspicious. And why are we suspicious? Because we hold these same news organizations and these same institutions and think tanks that are funded by war accountable. And so we are living in an intellectual no-fly zone right now. We are living in an information war, and that's why it's important for the mass population to have these critical media literacy skills so that they can differentiate what is propaganda, what is misinformation, which is actually being produced by the mainstream corporate media to continue to consent for war, to promote these endless wars and profits for the military-industrial complex, whereas we have independent media which are acting as watchdogs to the military class. So the United States purports that we are a democracy and we uphold our First Amendment. And in our First Amendment, we have a free press. But unfortunately, over the course of the last 20 to 30 years, we went from over 50 corporations owning the media in this country to now less than 6 corporations owning all of mass media in the United States. And that means that 6 corporations or less control over 90% of what Americans see, hear, and read. And those 6 corporations are linked to and sometimes owned blatantly by weapons manufacturers and defense contractors and special interest groups. Those are the same kinds of establishment organizations that the media is meant to hold accountable. And so what that tells us now about this consolidation of media is that we have a media that represents the interests of the top 1%. And so the corporate media has now become the official mouthpiece of defense contractors, weapons manufacturers like Lockheed Martin and Raytheon and General Dynamics. They represent the interest of the big pharmaceutical companies as well, and lobby groups and think tanks like like AIPAC and others, who are funded by sometimes foreign governments like the state of Israel and Saudi Arabia. Other think tanks that we are aware of, like the Atlantic Council, that have very strong ties within corporate media, is funded by NATO. Okay, and so we have a corporate media that acts as a mouthpiece for the war machine. And in that, through studies that we've conducted at MIT Press, if you look at some of the coverage of the war in Ukraine or the war in Gaza right now, we see a trend in that the majority of opinion pieces promoting these wars are coming from people and individuals who on the surface appear to be journalists. But if you actually look at their biographies and their About Us pages, they actually work directly for these think tanks that are funded by weapons manufacturers. And so this really tells us that we don't have a free press anymore. We have an extremist corporate media beating the drums of war. And this is why it's so important to support independent journalism. We are now down to, because of this consolidation, an information war between the corporate media and independent media. Independent media in this country, we're just like a handful of news organizations now. But we have a strong backing by the readers who are aware of this consolidation. They're aware of the corporate media being stenographers for the ruling military class. And so the difference is that independent watchdog journalists will present news and information from an independent perspective that holds the ruling class accountable. Whereas corporate media journalists will oftentimes frame news stories in a way that makes the ruling class and weapons manufacturers and the military class and maybe even the state of Israel or Ukraine as putting them in a positive light, like they are the good guys. So even if they do report on things like the war, like the famine that's taking place in Gaza, it's all about the media framing. They'll still always paint Palestinians as savages and unworthy victims, and that they somehow deserved that kind of treatment in their framing of those stories. And so it's really important to support independent media, especially today in this information war, as we do live in an intellectual no-fly zone, because with the rise of big tech social media giants who are also working hand in hand with the deep state, with the national security state, and with these think tanks that are funded by weapons manufacturers, they are cracking down on the free flow of information, and they are working to ensure that a pro-war narrative is dominant. The algorithms do not work in the favor of independent journalists. And so we have this false, perception that we have a free democratic society. We don't anymore. We are living in an oligarchy, and the way the media acts and the way that big tech acts is in the interest of those war profiteers to ensure that their wars are promoted and that they continue to be able to manufacture consent. However, we are seeing a shift in the way the public is receiving this information, especially right now with the way Israel is committing genocide in Gaza. We're seeing a rise of consciousness. We're seeing people have these awakenings in the way that media is promoting Israel's war on Gaza in a way where the veil has been lifted from the neoliberal class. The moral depravity of the liberal class has been exposed to the masses through this war. And so more and more people are actually turning to independent watchdog journalism outlets like Mint Press because they're sick and tired of the way the media is promoting an apartheid state. And they're connecting that to previous wars now and saying, maybe what I thought were justified humanitarian interventions, whether it be in Syria or Libya, or maybe sending arms to Ukraine, people are now realizing that these wars were based on lies, and there is really no such thing as a humanitarian war. And the reason why I keep mentioning war as a major thing is because our government and our economy is fueled by the military-industrial complex, and that's what keeps this empire running. And we're starting to see a major shift in people's awareness, and not just them turning to independent media, but their actions on the streets. People in mass are now taking to the streets to demand an end to the genocide in Gaza. And so this is a very beautiful thing that we're witnessing. It's an unfortunate tragedy that it took to wake people up. But sometimes in crisis, people do have those kinds of conscious awakenings. The media framing of the war, Israel's war in Gaza, has really exposed worthy and unworthy victims in the framing of corporate media coverage of what's happening in Gaza. And it showed the lack of contextual history that the corporate media outlets like the Washington Post and the New York Times have failed to present in its coverage of Israel's bombardment of Gaza. They have presented this crisis as starting on October 7th, and then even the events of October 7th have been presented with so many lies. The events of October 7th were shrouded in still a lot of mystery, and yet we were told that Hamas killed 1,400 Israelis. We were told they beheaded babies. We were told they carried out mass rapes and torture of civilians en masse. And the truth is that we really didn't know what happened on October 7th, shortly after October 7th, but the media went and ran with these stories right after October 7th. And these points were used to justify Israel's bombardment of Gaza. And it was an attack that has now cost the lives of more than 30,000 Palestinian civilians. We're not seeing images of Hamas political figures or commanders being killed in Gaza. We're seeing women and their children, and we're seeing fathers pulling their children out of the rubble. We're seeing people in their nightgowns and their slippers. Those are the people that are being killed, and babies. And so how much of that was really true? As the days went by and the months went by, more and more evidence emerged that challenged these narratives circulating around October 7th. And that was because of independent watchdog journalism outlets like Mint Press, like The Gray Zone, like Mondowise, who challenged those stories. And I want to go back to the story of the beheaded babies. That was the first accusation and claim that came out of October 7th by the state of Israel, by the Netanyahu government. And our own president, Joe Biden, went on national TV and said that he saw pictures of those beheaded babies himself. And immediately after, the White House itself went and retracted that claim. And we now know that that claim has no evidence to back it up, including from the Israeli military, which went on to say that they have no evidence to show for that. And yet we had the New York Times, the Washington Post, Politico, and so many other corporate media outlets lead with that headline, even after the Israeli military retracted, and even after Joe Biden's White House retracted that statement. I actually did a podcast in the month of, I believe it was December, with Alan McLeod, and we analyzed media headlines in that month. And now it had been over 30 days since the White House had retracted and the Israeli military had retracted the beheaded babies claim. And Politico was still, in that week in December, led with a headline that said, after the burial of the 50 beheaded babies. And so this was a blatant lie. Just a blatant lie, and it was still being reported on as if it was truth within corporate media. And even with the amount of people that were killed by Hamas, the 1,400 Israelis, that turned out to also be a lie. And so many other stories, including the story of mass rape. The story of mass rape was being led by an Israeli group who have made so many genocidal statements towards Palestinians and Ethiopian and African Jewish migrants to Israel. And so, but yet these organizations like the New York Times continued to lead with these headlines and are still leading with these headlines. But it is the coverage of independent corporate media that goes to the root of these stories and tracks where these statements come from and asks the question, is this a reliable source? Well, Israel is an apartheid state that has come out openly and made statements by its political figures and military commanders that their goal is to wipe out Gaza. And so their words cannot be taken seriously as fact. And yet they are given unlimited airtime space within corporate media to justify their actions. With the war, with Israel's war raging on in Gaza, something really interesting has happened, which is people who have been consuming mainstream corporate media, they have been able to develop even stronger critical media literacy skills just by the mere fact that the media is blatantly lying about their goals in supporting Israel in its war in Gaza, because we have this really stark contrast with, you know, our liberal politicians standing in front of the TV, giving us a really heartwarming statement with a really nice smile, and sometimes even with tears, talking about how much they care about civilian life, and they're really sorry and just can't believe that people are dying in Gaza, and they're doing everything they can to prevent those deaths. Meanwhile, they are actively giving Israel the very means and weapons to drop on the civilians in Gaza. And so this has allowed people to have a conscious awakening, because it's just so blatant. It's just so obvious that they are lying to us about their care for civilian human life. And so what this has done is really charge this anger inside of people. And so now we're seeing this mass mobilization and organizing of people across the world, in fact, not just here in the United States, but across Western so-called democracies, demanding that they end their support for Israel. And I'm just using this as one example of this revival of anti-war sentiment and empowerment that we're seeing around the world. And this has allowed for people who normally wouldn't even be mobilized or that political to get up and protest on the street, to get up and block ships from delivering weapons to Israel. Even people who work within those companies and shipping companies, they are the ones who are leading the way to stop those shipments from taking place. And we saw the very brave and yet horrific act of self-immolation by an active duty member, Aaron Bushnell, who used his privilege from within the US military and Air Force to draw attention to the US's support for Israel. I mean, he was so horrified, and he was somebody who willingly joined the military, and yet he was so horrified by Israel's actions that he used his privilege. He made a decision to use his privilege to wake humanity up, because 6 months now, almost 6 months into this war, people are becoming desensitized. And he woke a sleeping giant once again to take action. And that's why it's so important for people to have this critical media literacy, because we are able to recognize that the very people who purport to support human rights and democracy and freedom of speech and social justice are actually the ones who have exposed their moral depravity through this war. They have no intention of supporting free speech and democracy and human rights. What they represent are the interests of war profits. They represent the interests of blood and war and destruction and exploitation around the world. And so sometimes it does take something really horrific like the war in Gaza to take place for people to wake up, but that's what we're seeing right now.